Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Workforce Wednesday webinar. My name is Kirsten Bayer with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University, and I will be your moderator and technical support for today's session. So you can feel free to reach out to me if you need any technical assistance or if you need any links to anything. Feel free to reach out to me via the chat. I'll put my email in the chat momentarily as well. If you need anything following the session, you can feel free to reach out to me via email as well. Today, we are going to be talking about understanding substance use disorders, and we are joined once again by Mary Gablee. We have heard presentations from her before, so we are excited to welcome her back today and learn a little bit more about understanding substance use disorders. Before we get started with Mary's presentation, a couple of housekeeping things we would like to go over with you is that we are on the Zoom webinar platform, so you do not have the ability to unmute yourselves. We ask that if you have questions or comments or concerns to please post those in the chat or the Q&A, and we will have time for live questions and answers at the end of the session, where you can ask Mary any of those questions and we'll facilitate them. We also will be having a follow-up email and follow-up survey that we will send out to you. I will actually put the follow-up survey in the chat towards the end of the session here, but we will have a follow-up email where you can have the access to the URL that has the recording and the presentation slides for today. We do have the presentation slides available for you, and we will put those, a link to those in the chat momentarily here as well. But you'll get that same link tomorrow in your follow-up email, and you can access the recording there and the presentation slides, as well as all of our past Workforce Wednesday webinars are on there as well if you missed one from last year or in the past and you would like to access those there. I believe that's all I have to say. Oh, and this session is being recorded, and so the recording will be up there as well. But I believe that's all I have to say. If I forget anything, I'll fill it in here as we're doing our beginning polls. But first, this morning, we would just like to know, where is your local area and where are you joining us from this morning? So I am actually joining you from Decatur, Illinois, which is where I reside, but our office is in Bloomington Normal. So we are in central Illinois. And typically I'm in the office, but today I'm able to work from home. So today I am joining you from Decatur. Mary, where are you joining us from today?
Northern Illinois.
Northern Illinois. All right. So she's up there with all of you Northern Illinoisans and Chicagoans. So it looks like we have quite a few people joining us from across the state, across the board. So I'm going to go ahead and end that poll and share the results, and you should be able to see where everyone's joining us from this morning. Maybe you have a colleague who's on here with you as well, and you're both joining from the same place. So we appreciate you answering that for our analytical purposes. And then our next question is just, which partner do you best represent? So are you joining us from Title 1, 2, 3, or 4, or do you best represent another WIOA partner or stakeholder or a state or local workforce innovation board? So we'll give everyone about 30 seconds to answer that question. Looks like most of us are joining from Title I today, but we do have a couple people sprinkled across all 4 titles, as well as 5 people joining us from another WIOA partner or stakeholder. So I'm going to end that poll and share the results so you guys can all see the debriefing that I just gave you. Thank you so much for answering those beginning polls. Those really help us for analytical purposes when we're discussing topic choices and things like that for these Workforce Wednesday webinars. So we appreciate your feedback. I'm going to hand it off to Mary to start her presentation. And then, like I said, I will be putting in the chat the slide deck, my email if you need to reach out to me after the session. And then towards the end of the session with Mary, I will put in the follow-up survey into the chat as well if you have a couple minutes to your day and want to take that for us. So Mary, go ahead and take it away. Start your presentation.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. It's my pleasure to be here again with you today. We're going to talk today about understanding substance use disorders. I am a licensed social worker and a licensed clinical professional counselor, and I have worked in behavioral health for over 40 years. So I'd like to share some information with you today. So today we'd like to talk about just what it means to have a substance use disorder, because it's biological, sociological, and psychological, and also what are some of the evidence-based practices to help people with their recovery. And I know sometimes it's hard for us to even understand, why do people start using these drugs in the first place? It just doesn't even make sense. And sometimes we tend to be judgmental about that. So, and it's really hard to understand, why do they keep using drugs when they have bad things happen to them? When they get arrested, they lose their family, they lose their loved one, they lose a job, and they still continue to use regardless. Very, very difficult for us to understand. But what we need to realize is that the drugs work. Think about that, the different categories I have up here. We have cocaine or crack or meth or ice. It makes you feel more confident. It gives you a euphoric mood. You just feel great. And opioids, they help with pain, but also physical and emotional pain. And of course, tranquilizers calm you down. Cannabis also makes you feel good, it relaxes you, but also heightens your senses. And things like PCP and Special K, they are anesthetic, and they also help you dissociate, just go off to la la land. And of course, alcohol gives us the false courage. It helps calm us down and gives us confidence. So what are the causes of substance use disorder? Is it because these people have done something horribly wrong, or they're bad people? Maybe they just don't have willpower. Why can't they just say no? Are they just making poor choices? They have a choice. Why are they choosing the drugs? So what I'd like to talk about today is this neuroscience, because the neuroscience supports the whole idea that substance use disorder is actually a brain disease. And it's a complicated disease because it has biological, sociological, and psychological components. So neuroscience, if you look that up at dictionary.com, it's going to tell you it's the field of everything about that brain, how it's developed, how it's structured, how it functions, the chemistry that goes on. So we have to understand that our brain really controls everything we do, what we think, what we feel, and our behavior. So nothing happens without that brain. So substance use disorder is actually an illness of the brain. And it's what we call a chronic condition. Chronic means there's no cure, and also that it will go on for life. So when we think about substance use disorder, we should really compare it to other illnesses like diabetes and high blood pressure, for example, because these are also very complex illnesses. And we also should understand that because it's a chronic disorder, like those other disorders, that people are going to relapse. There isn't just one treatment that makes it all go away. People can recover, but they are going to slip. They are going to have relapses. So there's a book that we use called the DSM, or Diagnostic Statistical Manual, that helps us diagnose people with any kind of mental or emotional problems. And in the DSM-5, which is the most recent out, they've come up with now 10 classes of drugs plus gambling. The old DSM-4 called it addiction, and we're trying really hard these days not to call it an addiction, because a couple of things have happened. One is the name calling and the label, referring to somebody as an addict. But there's also stigma attached to the word addiction, and people are not getting the help that they need. So in these 10 classes of drugs plus gambling, it's not just is there a problem, but it's how it's impacting their whole life. And do they have cravings? And then it's brought into 3 different categories. Is it mild, moderate, or severe? So here are the 10 classes of drugs in that DSM-5. There's alcohol, caffeine, cannabis, hallucinogens, inhalants, opioids, sedatives, stimulants, tobacco, and then just a group of other substances. We also have to understand the difference between abusing and having a substance use disorder. So abuse is more of a problem, okay? That's when we have made bad choices, okay? Because we're using it to either calm ourselves down or maybe celebrate or just wanting that feeling of high. But see, that can really be tackled through mostly education and positive reinforcement. But when we get into things like substance use disorders, that's the brain disease. And that includes genetic vulnerability and also what's going on with the person's environment. So it really is very, very complex. And quitting takes a lot more than a strong will. And I know many, many years ago, we had the big national theme of just say no. Well, that really is downright silly if you really understand how your brain is affected. Again, it's chronic and it's going to be constantly relapsing. And people are going to choose it regardless of any harmful consequences. So we have to help them and get them the treatment that they need. So if we understand the brain and how it's working before people start using and while they're using, I think it will help us understand that this really is a disease. This is just an interesting list of many of the different drugs and how addictive they are. And believe it or not, the most addictive drug out there is a legal one called nicotine. So that is the most addictive drug there is. And you can see heroin is next, followed by crack, cocaine, and then alcohol. So how do people get dependency? First of all, they have to use the drug, okay? But also a genetic influence or vulnerability. And one of the biggest ones is the environmental influences. What's going on in that person's life with people, places, and things. So you put those three together and they are the components. So let's look at the genetic vulnerability for dependence. That really accounts for 40 to 60% of people that have a substance use disorder. And there is what we call a problem in the pleasure pathway in the brain. And I'll show you some diagrams that will help you understand that, because the people then cannot control it. There is no control. And also the drugs that they're using try to match the need in the chemical system, which is totally not normal. And of course, when people start using, it's important to know, because the younger the person starts using drugs, of course, the worse it's going to be for them. And it's going to be more of a severe range and it'll take a longer time to heal. So back to those environmental factors. We have, first of all, the community domain. Where is that person living and what's going on in their world? Is everyone there using alcohol and other drugs? And what about their peers? What about the people they hang around with? Is it just kind of the normal thing to do, or let's all get high together? What's going on in the family? Is that something that everybody does? You know, soon as somebody gets home, they have their 5 o'clock cocktail. And what about the work or the school domain? What's going on there? Again, is it everybody's doing it, or do we have a habit of doing it, or do we all do it together? So let me tell you a little bit about some research that'll help you understand how the brain works. I want to talk about Rhesus monkeys. Rhesus monkeys are very, very close to human beings in a couple of ways. One is their DNA. They're only second in line close to us with being the same kind of DNA structure. The only one closer would be a chimpanzee. But they're also very close to us as far as is our blood and the antigens in the blood. They even preceded humans into outer space starting in 1949. So let's talk a little bit about this experiment. Why Rhesus monkeys? Well, again, they're very close to humans with the DNA, but they're very close to humans, both brain chemistry wise, but also socially. Rhesus monkeys live in groups, and they have to live in groups. They communicate with each other, they take care of each other, and they are very, very helpful to each other. And so the researchers decided, let's actually separate them and find out what happens to these monkeys if they aren't living in their groups. So this all happened up in Madison, Wisconsin, and they had an isolated group of monkeys that were singly in a cage. They couldn't see or hear or even smell or touch any other monkeys like them. They were way, way off. And then there was another group that they just left in their groups. So what happened to the brain chemistry? Those that were socially isolated, they actually took tests and found out that the dopamine in their brain was very, very low. They were totally stressed out, and they had a feeling of subordination, like, I don't care, do whatever you want. I don't care, I have no control over anything. And if they were offered food or cocaine, they would take the cocaine. If they were offered water or cocaine, they took the cocaine. Whereas the other group that stayed together, they had very high dopamine levels. They were not stressed out. And if they were offered water or food or cocaine, they took the water or the food. So let's talk again a little bit about the brain itself, one of the most important organs in our body. And it looks like just one thing, but actually it's composed of billions and billions of nerve cells called neurons. These neurons have what we call like little finger-like appendages, okay, that are called dendrites. And they really don't actually touch each other. So the space between those little finger-like appendages is called a synapse. So how do we get information from one brain cell to another? Chemistry. The chemicals are called neurotransmitters, and there are more than 60 neurotransmitters in our brain just to keep it functioning and get the information going. So again, it really looks like these nerve cells are touching each other to communicate, but they are not. There is a space in between each one that's called a synapse, and they have to use the chemical to get that information across that synapse. And when they do, things literally spark up. So it's not just the chemicals in the brain, it's also where in the brain is there a chemical disturbance. That'll determine what the disturbance would be. So it's not just the functions of the neurons, it's also the dysfunction and where in the brain is that happening. So what we're going to talk about is the reward center. And the reward center is how we send information up to the prefrontal cortex. That prefrontal cortex is right up here, okay, right behind your forehead, which is one of the strongest bones in your body, so it can be protected. And why do we need it to be protected so much more highly than any place else under our skull? Well, because that's where our executive functions are. That is how we plan and organize and stay on task and get things done. We can wait, we make decisions. All of that happens there in the executive functions. It's also where our personality is located. What's interesting about this is it does not mature. It's the last thing in your body to mature. And it does not mature till you're at least 25 or 26 years of age. And of course, what runs that prefrontal cortex, those executive functions, it's all about dopamine. So, and why are younger people more vulnerable? Okay, what about the people who are under 25 or 26 years of age that start using alcohol and other drugs? Well, that frontal cortex is not developed yet, right? So instead, their decisions are made in their brain in a little teeny area called the amygdala. So if you look at that little picture in the bottom right-hand corner, you're going to see a little red dot. It's very, very small, and it's buried deep in the brain. And it's buried because it has to be protected too, because that is where decisions are made as far as our safety. If something is a threat, are we going to fight, flight, or freeze? It also controls all of our emotions, our motivation, and our memories. So here's some examples of some of the neurotransmitters, but there's really the big three when it comes to substance use disorders and all behavioral health disorders. And those would be serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. These three together are called the monoamines. And you can see that the information goes both ways in this synapse, right? The chemicals are being sent and also coming back. That's totally information sharing. So these big three, the dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin, really control our destiny, whether it's our mental health or substance use disorders. So this is another good example of the brain and chemically how it works. If you look at the pathways that are in blue, that's how the dopamine gets around in your brain. And you can see it really needs to be concentrated in the prefrontal cortex, because dopamine helps us feel our sense of reward, which also gives us a sense of motivation. But it also controls our pleasure, it controls our motor function, and also our compulsions. Now, if you look at the other pathway here, look at what that controls. Our functions are the mood, the memory, and sleep, and even cognition. But definitely the dopamine is a big one in the prefrontal cortex. This is another slide that helps you understand the different parts of the brain and what goes on there. So again, in that prefrontal cortex, we got to make our judgments, our decisions. And you can see where the vision is located, the coordination, but you see right in the middle, there's what we call the reward pathway. That's how we get information up to the prefrontal cortex so that we can make good judgments and good decisions. But it also makes us feel rewarded. And of course, feeling rewarded also makes us feel more motivated. So what about these substances? How do they get involved with that reward pathway? Well, you can see right now, these are all big terms, so sorry about that, but it's all part of the biology of this. So information goes to your VTA, it jumps up to your nucleus accumbens, and it goes up to the prefrontal cortex to make a decision. But if you see in the bottom right-hand corner, you're going to see that before the information can get up to that prefrontal cortex, it is interrupted by things like alcohol, cocaine, and heroin. So there is a sending and receiving of chemical information. The brain is sending the dopamine up to that prefrontal cortex, but the prefrontal cortex is sending information down using another chemical called glutamate. And we're going to watch a short video so we can understand how that happens.
The dopamine neurons send their reward processing up. They get from the VTA, the NA, and then to the frontal cortex. Now the frontal cortex becomes involved. It sends glutamate neurons back down to the midbrain. As the brain generates an experience of pleasure, the neurons going up release dopamine. And the neurons going down release glutamate.
Normally, this up and down communication enables the brain to recognize and learn those things in the environment that are good for survival.
Dopamine says, hey, this is important.
Glutamate says, okay, I'll remember.
Dopamine says, hey, I really want this.
Glutamate says, fine, go and get it.
That's the way this elegant but delicate system was meant to work. For food, for sex, for Madeline cookies.
Drugs go straight to this mechanism and wipe it out. These surges of neurochemicals are like flash floods tearing through the landscape of the brain. Each use of the drug, every flash flood, ravages the brain's delicate physiology, sweeping away everything in its path.
With time, deep channels are carved into the brain. Drug pathways become stronger and stronger. Normal pathways become weaker and weaker. Dr. Stephen Hyman of Harvard University calls addiction a pathological overlearning of the drug and all that goes with it. This isn't a normal memory. This is a drug hypermemory, and these memories may be permanent. They leave the addict vulnerable to relapse even after years of abstinence.
So hopefully that was a little bit helpful to help understand about this swapping the chemicals back and forth. Now, drugs also cause disruption in the brain in other ways. They can imitate the brain's chemistry, and they can actually fool your brain and send it abnormal messages, especially things like cannabis and heroin. But the other drugs like cocaine and like meth, they really overstimulate that reward circuit, give you way too much dopamine. So again, dopamine really rules in that reward system. It produces a euphoric effect. It actually teaches people, again, to repeat the behavior of using those drugs. And then the drug itself, the brain itself, stops making dopamine, thinking, oh, we don't need to make any more dopamine. We can get it from alcohol. We can get it from cocaine. And the person starts to use the drug even more and more, which is what we call tolerance. Another interesting research study that was done about alcohol and other drugs was the rats. And rats' brains are actually very close chemically to ours and make very comparable decisions. So they would put rats in cages, and they would actually have a little lever that they could push. And the lever would be for water, okay, and for food. And then they could also introduce Mrs. Rat. Because the three things that any population needs to sustain itself are water, food, and sex in order to keep that population going. So in this case, for the research, they wanted to find out what would happen to rats who were given other drugs. So when a rat was introduced with the cocaine, they would choose the cocaine over being offered water. They would choose the cocaine over being offered food, and they would choose the cocaine after being offered to see Mrs. Rat. So what happened to those? Obviously, they did not make it through the research study. And this was done over many, many years. So hopefully that helps you understand why a person is thinking, gee, I have a great family, I have a terrific life. Why would I go ahead and choose those drugs? Because they have to, they need to. Their brain chemistry is telling them they have to. So again, these drugs are interfering with that reward pathway. Heroin jumps in first, alcohol second, cocaine and nicotine third. And so they block that dopamine from going up to the reward pathway. And let's take a look too about physically what happens to the brain that will help you understand some of the chemistry that goes on. So this is a PET scan that will show you how your brain changes. So if you look at the left-hand side, see how everything is fired up and kind of fired up evenly. And that light yellow is probably the strongest dopamine, and it's everywhere where you need to be. But then look at the right-hand side for somebody who has a substance use disorder. In that prefrontal cortex, in the place where you make all your decisions, there's no activity at all. And you don't even see it throughout the whole rest of the brain. This is a PET scan that shows what happens with somebody who is not using cocaine versus somebody who is addicted to cocaine. And again, you'll see how the chemicals are all pretty evenly distributed on the left-hand side, but are not at all on the right-hand side. And this one that's a little fuzzy, sorry about that. You see a non-dependent brain on the left, but an opioid dependent on the right. And again, you're not seeing much of that red or dark orange, which is the dopamine. The other things that happen is some drugs like cocaine can actually stop you hearing and thinking what you're supposed to be doing. So your brain resources, everything is going as I just need that drug. So let's hear some comical examples of that. So think about your dog, right? Okay, Ginger, I've had it. You stay out of the garbage. Understand, Ginger? Stay out of the garbage or else. But what does Ginger really hear? Blah, blah, Ginger, blah, 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 Ginger, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's very comparable to what somebody hears when they have a substance use disorder. They might hear somebody say, if I see you smoking crack, I'll arrest you. But what are they really, really hearing that officer say? Blah, blah, crack, blah, blah, blah. And then let's talk about the physical structure of the brain too. It's called gray matter. That's the tissue that actually helps us process all this information we get through the chemistry. But gray matter actually decreases with people that have schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety, and substance use disorder. So again, whether it's a serious mental illness or a substance use disorder, every time somebody relapses, they lose part of their gray matter. And unfortunately, we can't grow the gray matter back. We can grow just about everything else from our hair to our skin to our liver, but we cannot regrow the gray matter in our brains. And that's because all of these illnesses are all having the same common brain architecture. So when people have a substance use disorder, they're totally out of control. They don't have any control. Their mind isn't even thinking properly. And of course, they're going to continue to use regardless of what happens to them. And they're going to relapse pretty much all the time until they have a very, very stable recovery. And let's talk about that too. What makes people relapse? One of the number one causes is stress. And I think this video will help you understand how that works.
There are three things that are known to cause relapse. Drugs, because they cause surges of dopamine. Drug cues, because they affect glutamate. And stress, which causes the release of the neurohormone corticotropin releasing factor, or CRF. The theory that explains the role of stress in addiction was developed by Dr. George Koob of the Scripps Research Institute in La Jolla, California, and Dr. Michel Lemole of the University of Bordeaux in France. Koob and Lemole refer to the brain's stress system as its anti-reward system because CRF acts to counter dopamine surges. If dopamine gets too high, for instance during a binge drinking episode, the brain pushes back with CRF to restore balance. Ordinarily, the brain maintains this balance or homeostasis around a hedonic set point, much the way it maintains body temperature around the set point of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. During an infection, the brain resets its body temperature set point, and we get a fever. The brain's hedonic system works much the same way. With the repeated dopamine surges of drug use, the stress system is chronically overstimulated, and the brain can't maintain homeostasis. So what does the brain do? It gives up on homeostasis and reverts to what Lemole call allostasis. Allostasis is the process of regaining stability through change. And what changes? The brain's hedonic set point. In a desperate attempt to restore balance in the face of chronic drug use, the brain resets its pleasure threshold. Balance is restored, yes, but at a cost. Normal dopamine releases from normal pleasures no longer register, and the brain's pleasure system goes flat. Psychiatrists have a word for this state of the brain. They call it anhedonia. Under severe, prolonged stress, the brain becomes unable to derive normal pleasure from normally pleasurable things. Since normal pleasure is no longer registered, this person is essentially pleasure deaf. If you take them to Disneyland, everyone else has a good time, but they say, I don't get it. So what does register? Things that release so much dopamine that they reach the new pleasure set point. And what things do that? These dopamine surges cause the brain to lock onto the drug. From now on, anytime the brain is stressed, it goes straight to the thing that it knows is best at relieving that stress, and that's the drug. And this connection of the drug to survival is below the level of consciousness. Relapse is a process that is underway long before the addict is ever aware of it. I think this goes a long way to explaining why addicts have a tendency to relapse at precisely the most inopportune moment. The day before their court hearing, the day before the big job interview or family reunion. It looks like the addict doesn't care about these things, but that's not what's happening. It's when they get stressed, they relapse. They don't know why, it just happens.
So hopefully that helped you understand about the stress and the relapse. And for stress, remember the list that he was giving you, there were happy times of stress that were stressful, and there were not so happy times. So it doesn't make any difference if it's good stress or bad stress. It really is going to result in a relapse without having a good recovery system. So let's talk about some risks of putting people at risk of having a substance use disorder. Biology is going to be half. Remember, we talked about genetic vulnerability. So, and this also follows gender, ethnicity, and mental disorders. So, for example, if we have a male child of a male child of a male child of an alcoholic, the next child really isn't going to have much option not to become one, and unless they cannot start the drug in the first place. Ethnicity really plays a part too. There are certain ethnic groups that are such a higher risk. People in Ireland, people in Alaska, Native Americans, for example. And then people that have a serious mental illness, they're definitely at risk of having a substance use disorder and often try the substances to control their mental illness. The other risk, of course, is the environment. What kind of a support system does the person have? What is their socioeconomic status? Are they getting a lot of pressure from their peers to use? Have they ever been traumatized? Have they ever been physically, mentally, or sexually abused? And again, what age is this starting at? Because the younger the age, the more serious the problem will be, because the brain is not yet developed. So hopefully now this helps you understand that substance use disorder is a disease that is biological, sociological, and psychological components with it as well. Now, here's some good and some bad news about the brain. The brain has what we call neuroplasticity, okay? And the neuroplasticity actually changes in our brain according to activities or actual skills, or from injury or even a disease. So the disease of substance use disorder changes the chemistry and the plasticity in our brain. However, we do know that treatment helps and can move the plasticity in the right direction. So just because neuroplasticity can cause our brain to adapt one way, it also helps us understand that we can adapt and make changes for healing. There is no cure for substance use disorder, but there certainly is treatment and healing through therapy. And also treatment is really going to be over the long haul. And I really think that these slides and these PET scans help you understand. We have somebody on the left who doesn't use meth. We have somebody in the center who was a meth user, but they were 1 month abstinent. You can see, you know, they're starting to get a little bit of activity, but even after 36 months or 3 years, the brain is still not back to what it was from the beginning. So again, there is healing, okay, but there is no cure through the treatment. And the treatment model starts out with detox. You have to get that chemical out of the system. Then the person needs to go into rehab, and it depends how long it is depends on that particular person and their history. And even after treatment, they need an ongoing recovery support system. The American Society of Addictive Medicine has come up with certain criteria that people use in the substance use treatment field. This is a professional organization that goes back to 1954, and their goals are to help with the prevention, treatment, resistance, remission, and recovery. And of course, big on their list to promote is accessibility. Are people getting the treatment that they need? Is the treatment available? For ASAM, they start out with an assessment, and it's a very, very thorough assessment, and it's in 6 different dimensions. So the first dimension is really, again, going through that withdrawal. And we have to look at, gee, what is the person doing now, but also what's their past experiences of going through withdrawal. The next dimension is what's going on with them medically. What's their history of their health and how healthy are they right now at present? The third dimension is going more into their thoughts and their feelings. The fourth dimension, where are they at as far as changing? Are they ready to make a change in their lives? The fifth dimension looks at relapse, current use, and what continues to be problems. And the last dimension, recovery and living environment. Is the person got those people, places, and things to surround themselves to get through recovery? And then based on that assessment, ASAM has what we call levels of care. There's early intervention, which is very brief, but there's also the next level, outpatient services. The next level up would be intensive outpatient services. The next level up would be residential or inpatient services. And the highest level is medically managed intensive inpatient services. And everything is determined by what does that person need? We have to have a very thorough assessment that shows what we call medical necessity. Then after that, we have to develop a good treatment plan. And that treatment plan really has to be the client's plan. We don't do things, 2 people or 4 people. We try to do things with people. And a treatment plan really has all of these different components. The person's information, their diagnosis. It starts out with a problem. And then based on that problem, what are the goals? And the goals have to be SMART, which means specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time limited. And for every goal, there needs to be an intervention. How are we going to get this done? There should be a time frame. How long is it going to take? And a responsibility. Who's going to do it? And we should always constantly review the progress that people are making and the outcomes of their treatment plans. Now, there are some things that we know from treatment. Okay, people have literally changed their behavior if they're going to be able to stay in recovery. And most of the treatment effects don't last very long after the treatment is over. And we have to make sure that people that are, if they're not monitored, of course, they're going to be at a greater risk for relapse. So how can we help these folks? Well, there's what we call evidence-based practices. So there's cognitive behavioral therapy, which is teaching people to think differently so that they can act differently. And this is the one that's very active with changing that neuroplasticity. There's motivational interviewing, there's recovery support, and there's what we call medication-assisted treatment. Now, there's some other best practices that really help people with substance use disorders. 12-step groups, and then other groups that are not based on 12 steps, but are still self-help and mutual help groups. Things like Women for Sobriety, Life Ring Secular Recovery, and Smart Recovery. Here are some resources that I've included in the handouts if you want to check out any of this information further. And how about if we open it up for questions? Are people putting their questions in the chat box? Or should we allow them to raise their hands?
They
See, there are.
Yeah, they're putting some in the chat box.
Okay.
So the first question is, when a person is born addicted to heroin due to parental use, how much does that increase their chances of struggling with substance use disorder throughout their lifespan?
Well, good question. Excellent question. Thank you. Again, you saw how the brain chemistry has changed. So even if someone, while they're still in utero, all right, is becoming an addict, their brain chemistry has changed. So they're always going to be at risk. Now, again, with treatment and help, can they change that brain chemistry back? Yes, but there will always be a risk, not only for that particular drug, but opting to choose another drug. Because again, it's all about that dopamine. So hopefully that helps answer the question.
Great, thank you so much, Mary. The next question is, how do you help a client take that first step?
I think education is very, very important. I think that a lot of people that have substance use disorder don't understand it themselves. We don't do a very good job of talking about it in schools, whether it's grade school, high school, or college. And I don't think we do a very good job talking about it openly, even in our family milieu. So I think education is really important. If people understand what the drugs are doing to them, and it's not really their fault, it's not really their choice, I think they'll be a little bit more open-minded to get the help that they need. And especially if they understand what does recovery look like. And this isn't just an overnight or a one-year thing. This is a rest of your life thing. No differently than if you're diabetic, you have to have insulin for the rest of your life. And, if have high blood pressure, you're going to be on high blood pressure medication. So I really would turn to education and reducing the whole stigma that is attached to substance use disorder.
Great, thank you. The same person, Nikki, asked, how can you help someone to change if they haven't decided to change, but the court system is forcing them to change?
Well, one of the positive things about the court system are what we call problem-solving courts. And whether it's mental illness or substance use disorder, there are problem-solving courts throughout the entire state of Illinois, in just about every county, if not judicial circuit. Because remember, people are not thinking properly when they have a substance use disorder. They don't just say, okay, I'm going to change and turn on and off a light switch. And even if they are ready for change, they're going to still constantly have that problem with the chemical upset in their brain until they literally regrow that, right? Change their neuroplasticity. So the one thing that problem-solving courts can do is to help keep the person out of trouble and keep them into treatment, but at the same time, monitor their symptoms and monitor their compliance with the treatment. So if people end up in the justice system, it's preferred that they go to a problem-solving court, if at all possible.
Okay, I believe that's all the questions that are in the chat thus far. We'll give everyone a couple more minutes here to answer any questions or ask any questions they would like to. I'm going to go ahead and put in the chat the follow-up survey. If you have a couple of minutes here briefly after we log off of the webinar, we ask that you please take this follow-up survey. We send that information to Mary for her presentation feedback, and then we also take the feedback for future Workforce Wednesday webinars and topic scheduling and things like that. So we would greatly appreciate your participation in that follow-up survey. The same survey will be on the follow-up email tomorrow. So if you don't have the time right now or would rather just do it tomorrow, you can access the same link there. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat for everyone.
I saw it looks like we're getting a couple more questions as well.
Yes. So another question is, so when a person has a good family unit to go home to after rehab, will it help dopamine levels stay more consistent?
I think that it's a great question. And I think family support is very, very important. And of course, I use the term family broadly because family is like, who did you spend Christmas with or the 4th of July with? It might not necessarily be, mother, father, sister, brother, aunt, or uncle. So it's really your support system. It's important too that they have the education and that they have the support because again, the life has got to change. So it's no different than if you went home with a diagnosis of diabetes, your family would have to be educated about what do you need to do for your diet? What do you need to do for your medication? What do you need to do for your nutrition and exercise? Because if the people that you live with all understand that, they're going to be able to be more supportive of you. So it's very, very important for the family to be educated and supportive too. And that will definitely help.
Great, thank you so much for answering that, Mary. The other things that are in the chat is me. I apologize. I did put in the chat at the very beginning of the session, the slide deck and everything, but I accidentally only sent it to the hosts and panelists, and I didn't send it to everyone. So I apologize for that. So I did go ahead and send it to everyone now. There's the website where you can access all of our 2022 Workforce Wednesday webinars. You can also access the 2021 ones on there if you missed any of those last year. And you can also see upcoming webinars on that website as well if you would like to register for any of our upcoming topics. We have a whole trauma series that we're bringing from ICOI who will be presenting. So make sure you register for those in advance. That's upcoming in March, into February and March for us. And then we also, I also put in the direct link to the direct slide deck for today for Mary's presentation. Mary, I don't see any other questions in here.
Well, I really want to thank you all so much for coming. I think this is an important topic to share, and thank you for allowing me to share it with you. I think it's going to help us understand, our coworkers, our clients, even our family members and friends. And the more we can stay educated and informed, I think the better off we can be to help people get the help that they need.
Yes, absolutely great. Thank you so much for your time today, Mary. Thank you for your time to all of our attendees. We had a thank you. This was much needed, being a newer therapist in the chat here from Jacob McKnight. So he thanks you. And we just thank all of you attendees for participating today. If you would like to, this was recorded, so you can send this recording out to anyone and you'll receive that link in the follow-up email tomorrow. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you.